Okay, so right now I'm going to talk a little bit more about soil. And the reason I'm doing this today is a follow-up on my last video, or a previous one, where I uncovered my sunflower shoots all proudly, only to find they were covered in mold. And I did a little discussion about why that is, and really talked about airflow, soil moisture, the mix of the soil, things like that. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm quite belatedly going to make some amendments and just talk about a few things around soil. Now, technically, I don't feel I need to make any changes to my soil. I think what I did is I actually just overwatered my soil when I sowed my last sunflower crop. And if I just was on top of my watering, that wouldn't have happened. Airflow could have been an issue as well as the type of mixture. And it's the type of soil mixture that's got me a little concerned. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to add some vermiculite to that mix. You could use vermiculite or perlite, any product like that to just lighten up the soil. One of you had made a comment about having sort of like 2 yards of soil and then adding about a yard and a half of perlite to it. I'm not going to add quite that much in terms of proportion, but I am going to add some. So what I've done since looking at that stuff is I've left my trays of soil that I prepped previously just sitting here. And there's a couple things, and this has been about 10 days, so there's a couple things I want to talk about here. So first of all, my top tray here has dried out pretty good. And one of the things I'm always looking at is I'm lifting a tray to determine how much water is in it, and then I can get in there and I can kind of see by feeling it what it looks like. And as I open this up, I can see there's a tiny bit of moisture in there, not a lot. And the other thing I'm looking for is the amount of dust that comes up. And there's a little bit of dust with that, so that tells me it's really dry. But this was a tray sitting on top, and that makes sense. So this is going to go into my soil mixing bin here in my kitchen. Don't do this in your kitchen at home. Now the reason I wanted to talk about that is because I have 2 trays stacked underneath that, and they are significantly heavier. And you can see by looking at them, there's a good amount of moisture in there still. And so the reason I wanted to demonstrate that is these have been sitting there for, 3 weeks probably, maybe even longer. And there's still moisture in this soil. And so the reason I'm talking about that is I hear time and time again about people sowing their crop, covering it, and then uncovering it to water it. And it's a completely unnecessary step. And the only reason I said that is I'm trying to help you do only as much work as you need to do. If work needs to be done, you do it. But if you're creating steps that don't need to exist, especially at the commercial scale, it's just extremely inefficient. And from a home perspective as well, it's just one more responsibility you need to think of. So you really, once your tray is covered, if you've got weight on top, you're not going to have to worry about, you shouldn't have to worry about watering again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix these 2 trays back in here as well. So I want to get a good mix. And I can see, like, as I'm getting in here, I can tell by the way the soil is sticking that the moisture is in there. And I can squeeze this soil. And I don't know if you can see, but I'm squeezing water out of there. And this is, almost a month later after putting it in the soil and it being inside. So there's 2 things there. One is, once again, speaking to the value of covering your trays and keeping them covered, because then there's no way for that soil moisture to evaporate. But it's telling me something about this soil mix. The soil mix that I used for 7 or 8 years at the Food Peddlers, it could not hold water this well. So I'm learning more about the soil mix just in uncovering it. And that's pointing again to a little bit of a need to be adding some perlite or vermiculite in order to lighten that up. So that's why I'm doing it here today. So I'm basically just getting my soil back into its bin, getting ready to mix things up. What's nice is that one of my trays was quite dry. So by adding the 2 wet trays to the dry tray, that's going to help distribute that moisture a little better. And I'm just going to mix this in really, really well here to get it kind of not only just mixed up, but I'm kind of introducing air back into the soil as well. That's going to help with any moisture reduction or going to help with any mold issues, anything like that. So mixing this up good, and I can feel as I mix it, it's starting to feel like a lighter mix for sure. And it's basically, I'm distributing that moisture now amongst 3 trays instead of the 2. that were quite moist. So now I'm going to take some of my perlite. I'll do this in, I'm not going to add, I'm just going to add it. And here I've got like maybe a liter's worth there, maybe 2 liters worth. And I'm going to mix this in. So I'm just going to add enough vermiculite that I can start to feel a difference in this soil. Or what I'll also be able to do is see the difference in the soil, because it's going to be lighter because just the color of the mix. So really happy with that. I can see it getting a little lighter, but I'm going to add a little bit more after this, just to really try to make sure I don't have that issue again. So yeah, I did that first bit. I'm going to add a little bit more here. And basically just adding this soil, this vermiculite to the soil to lighten it up. Now, I'm going to tell you another thing. So as I'm mixing the soil, I'm smelling what I would call stagnation. And there's a specific smell many of you are probably familiar with. And to me, it's the smell of anaerobic conditions. And that's just what I was getting. You get it from stinky compost piles that haven't been turned. You get it from standing water. So I was getting that smell, and I'm like, okay, well that tells me I had too much water in the soil. And once again, yeah, it's a lovely smell, isn't it? So that's just giving me more information, because everything I'm working from here is theory. The theory of airflow, the theory of too much water, the theory of my soil mix. They really are just guesses I'm making, but as it is with yourselves, they're educated guesses, and then I'm testing that guess. And then when I get indicators like smell like that, which indicates anaerobic conditions, that's telling me there's too much water in there, there's not enough space for gases. So really, as I'm thinking about it, I've actually added a bit more vermiculite than I said I would add. So that's just my intuition kind of taking over, is I really want to lighten up this mix. The reason is I think it has can't think of what the word is right now. It's like a chemical to help the water bind better to the peat, because peat generally can reject water really well. So so now I've changed my mix, and I can still smell that a little bit, but what's going to happen is a lot of bacteria are what we call facultative. They can live in an aerobic or an anaerobic state. And when they're in an aerobic state, which means with air, they're generally fairly beneficial. And when they go anaerobic, they can be detrimental. So I can take a soil that generally maybe isn't in the best shape, and just by adding air, improve it. Another example of this that some of you might be familiar with would be with a compost tea. And I used to take these big drums of water and I'd fill them with comfrey. I would let them rot for a couple of days and sort of soak up, and they would get really smelly. But then I would take air, I would put tubes in there, and I'd run air through that, sometimes adding actually a little bit of molasses to feed microbes. And within a day or two, it would start to smell sweet. So I can see the microorganisms making a change, and generally from being detrimental or generally disease causing to hopefully being beneficial or at least neutral. So that's what I'm thinking about here. So keeping that in mind, so I've got a nice mix here now. I really like this. It's definitely lighter. The combination of adding the 2 wet soils, trays of wet soil to the 1 dry tray, the perlite, or adding the vermiculite, sorry, and mixing it up has really lightened this mix. Now, because I want to sow a crop of sunflower, but because I smelled those anaerobic conditions, I'm going to let this sit for a day or two and let the air do its work and let those microorganisms make that change, and then I'm going to sow my crop. So I'm going to try and reduce the risk of problem there. Few things I'm noticing, and it's just good to notice these things, and you probably noticed them already. I can tell there was too much water in this tray by how much soil is still sticking to this tray, and it sticks in these little bits of clumps. And so I'm going to admit, in preparing these trays, I was clearly lazy, and I paid the price. I lost a tray of sunflower. It wasn't a big price to pay. Probably the bigger price to pay was uncovering that tray in a live video Lucky there's only ever a handful of people watching live, so very little risk there. But it's important to remember that these things can happen no matter how experienced you are. And in a commercial setting, you need to make a correction right away. But generally, you want to be paying attention all the time so as to avoid those problems, because it not only takes extra time to sort of amend them, but it also means you're losing a crop, which means you're losing revenue, which means generally it's going to be harder to pay your bills. And from a business perspective, that's something you really want to avoid. From a home production perspective, well, what that meant is I actually had to go to the store and buy sunflower shoots. And I had to go buy Food Peddler's sunflower shoots, which I ate for free for almost 10 years of my life. And that's very upsetting as well. So just a bit of a recap here, really focusing on the importance of not having too much water in your soil when you're going into your germination stage and seeding your crop. One of the things it does is it turns things anaerobic, just much more risk of disease and problems. Demonstrated at the beginning how well stacking actually keeps moisture within the soil, because there's nowhere for the soil to evaporate. The idea that you can lighten up your soil by adding some dry soil as well as some vermiculite or perlite. I think there was another point in there. Oh, and getting to know your soil mix. I'm getting to know this soil mix a little better. I'm sure it has a wetting agent. That's the word I was looking for earlier in there. So now I'm just changing how I work with it because I have that information. So I hope that's helpful. That's really stuff I've talked about over and over again, but I find in different forums people keep bringing up similar questions. And repeating things, and even just repeating the basics, I think is key. There isn't necessarily a whole lot of advanced techniques you need to be using to do good, successful production. So I'm going to let this sit for a few days, and then I will sow a crop. And if I think of anything meaningful to talk about while doing that crop, I'll post another video there. So hope that was helpful. Thanks for your time.